From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Barris here on a Thursday, and as always, glad to have you. This is something that the entire world has been engaged with over the past couple of weeks here now, and of course I'm talking about the conflict in Ukraine, the war that's happening there right now with Russia, and the involvement of the world, including, of course, the United States. And even if you have not been paying attention, which I'm sure you have, you'd have to live in a cave somewhere and never come out to not know about this, but you're certainly aware of how it's impacting you, at least on a superficial level here, when you look at the gas prices and the connection of what's happening in the unrest in the world and the role that the U.S. is playing. So we've been meaning to do a program on that this morning, and part of it is not only to get our experts' opinion and thoughts on it, but also to hear from you as well. You're going to be welcome to join in the conversation. 737-7587. If you have a thought on the way things are going or questions, it's your chance today. But I think it's almost something where Democrats and Republicans in unison, while they may differ some in the approach, agree that Putin and this act of aggression has to be stopped and there has to be a response to it, all right? And so it's nice to see that type of agreement. The question is, what more can be done and will it work? So we're going to talk about that this morning with Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt. You know, American foreign policy is a realm of your expertise. So certainly this is history being made right now. And Americans are very much in the thick of this as we see our president commenting almost every day. So it's good to have you on.
It's good to be back.
Thank you. Is this, from your perspective, fascinating to see as this develops? And there are so many dynamics to it. But from the American point of view, where we sit here today, and the role of America and the idea of our allies and everyone, economics seems to be the key to our response right now. That's it. Economics, not military response, but economic. And can that be enough?
Well, personally, I tend to doubt it. I think economics certainly can play a role. It might produce pressures. But I think economic sanctions, punishing a regime, works more effectively if that regime is a democracy or at least has some degree of popular input. What it doesn't have as quite as much is the input for a dictatorial regime. For example, we sanctioned Saddam Hussein for almost 13 years, and it didn't do anything.
Or Kim Jong-un.
Or Kim Jong-un.
So what you're saying is these despots, and they're all horrible people, from, you know, Putin's a horrible man. He doesn't give a crap what happens to his people, meaning that if they're going to be starving to death, well, I'm still going to do what I want. Whereas if someone tried to pull a stunt like that in this country, there'd be an uprising because they serve at our pleasure, our leaders, not the other way around.
Not the other way around. And in a sense, they can always blame the outsiders. What they do is they control the narrative, so to speak, the media, and they blame other countries. They invoke nationalism to blame the outside, to blame the West for persecuting the country. And that plays well with many countries because of a sort of feeling of inferiority or feeling of anger toward the American-dominated world economy and this sort of thing. So Putin plays on that.
I mean, you do hear some of the media reports, which have since kind of been shut down out of Russia. You know, you're hearing that Russian people there, most of them that, you know, we get word of, don't want this. They don't know much about it, one. And if they do know about it, they say they don't want the war, let the Ukrainians go. And yet, this is something where they have no power to really challenge what Putin is doing.
Well, we're not sure, because Putin still enjoys enormous support within Russia because he is seen as the figure who brought Russia back after the chaos and unrest during the 1990s. Because he's seen as having made Russia a great power again, he still enjoys a fair amount of popular support. And coupled with the fact that there's a media blackout, he's able to control how Russians hear and read about this. So to many Russians, he's liberating Ukraine from neo-Nazis, which is bizarre, but that is the narrative that many are being told.
Unbelievable. All right, so what is his end game here? What does ultimately he want? And do you believe he anticipated everything he's encountered to this point? I mean, he had to know there were going to be sanctions. Did he think it would get to the point where maybe the U.S. would stop oil imports, which is really, you know, the golden goose? And did he expect this type of resistance from the Ukrainians? You get the sense that he thought, well, we'll just roll on in and take it in a week.
Yeah, no, I think if he made a miscalculation, probably has more to do with the Ukrainian resistance than it does with our sanctions. I think he knew that there would be sanctions, but he thought perhaps they would be more divisive because Europeans are so much more dependent on Russian oil, and they haven't cut off the Russian oil yet, the Europeans. So he could have anticipated the sanctions. I think his end game originally, I think, was to take the Ukraine rather quickly. He figured that the government would fall, he could set up a pro-Russian government and enjoy a fair amount of support. I think people may have been telling him that Ukrainians wanted Russia to come in and provide order, to provide a better government, and he may have believed that. He may have believed that they would be greeted with enthusiasm by the Ukrainians, and the resistance probably may change what the end game is. The Russians recently offered, or at least said they were offering, a deal where they would pull out of the Ukraine if Ukraine recognized the annexation of Crimea that happened back in 2014, the independence of the Eastern republics, the Donbass region that recently has declared itself separate states, and declared its neutrality. Now, whether that's true or not, at least that seems to be a much more limited agenda than I thought originally he was going to demand.
Yeah, because we've heard that they've had some talks.
Yes.
And now, wasn't also part of the concern, he did not like the idea of maybe Ukraine sometime becoming part of NATO.
Right.
And I don't know if that was going to happen. I know Ukraine's been asking for that, but I mean, were there talks along these lines between Putin and Zelensky, prior to this, the very deal you just talked about?
Oh, yeah, no, they have discussed these issues. I think Ukraine, for a lot of reasons, wanted to join NATO to gain the military protection of the NATO alliance.
Yeah.
NATO wasn't going to let Ukraine in because of all sorts of reasons. Ukraine had complications with its borders. There was a great deal of resistance from other members who thought that it would bring conflict with Russia. So Putin did demand that Ukraine formally say, we will not join NATO, we are neutral. But in fact, this was, I think, an excuse more than anything, because the argument is that he didn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO because that would be bordering NATO on his borders.
Yeah.
But he already has that in the Baltic states are bordering, and they're members of NATO. So it was, I think, a bit of an excuse. I think he was trying to come up with a reason to invade Ukraine, to reunite Ukraine to Russia that was plausible to many people in the West, but was really an excuse.
Okay, so as far as Ukraine is concerned, you've never been to that country, have you?
I unfortunately have not, although my great-grandfather emigrated from there.
Is that right?
Yes.
Is that right? So in some ways, this is personal for you?
Well, not really. We don't have any connection with the Ukrainian, whatever our Ukrainian branch of our family.
Okay.
But I do know a little bit about their history through some genealogical.
So I'm just for, and you haven't been there, but I know you've studied and you probably have a handle on this, but for our viewers and for me, I mean, I'm trying to see, if you were to have gone prior to the war, and I know there's now a lot of the damage, but if I were to have visited Ukraine and popped down right there in one of the major cities, and comparing it to Russia and the like, I mean, are some of the major cities there modern, and there is a democracy there? What kind of area is it like? I mean, that's what hits home so much. I mean, we've heard of conflicts, by the way, wars that we don't pay as close attention to. Some of these third world countries, which we should pay more attention to, and you just don't pay a lot of attention. You see the areas that are being hit, and you don't see a lot of buildings, whatever. It's awful that they don't get the attention they deserve. But in this, I look at it and I'm like, well, that could be Nashville.
No,
I mean, this is a modern country with, cities that was in some ways thriving economically, right? Doing well. I mean, but for Russian standards.
Yeah.
I mean, and I look at that, and that's where it kind of hits home. It's like, well, I see these people running from these buildings in this downtown area that, that could be Nashville.
No, that's, I mean, Ukraine, compared to the rest of Europe, Ukraine was poorer.
Okay.
But it was still a part of Europe. The western city that so many of our reporters are in now, Lviv, was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and actually has a lot of Germanic, Austrian influence. But it's a very modern city, modern internet, modern communications. The countryside is poorer. and not as advanced as some of the Western countries, but it is a modern country with, it had, the problem it had, and this came up, of course, during the Trump administration, was a great deal of political corruption. A lot of Ukrainian oligarchs who basically siphoned off money, this sort of thing. There were conflicts between Russian-speaking Ukrainians and other Ukrainians over what relationship to have to Russia. Ukraine was a modern, flawed, poor democracy, but it was a democracy, it did have some degree of culpability and credibility as a democracy. And it's recently Zelensky, the president there, was elected in a fair election. He was a television personality who previously had played a president and then is elected, sort of like a Trump sort of celebrity being elected. And he's doing his best, or was doing his best, to get rid of this corruption. We know that President Trump called him up and talked to him about getting dirt on Joe Biden. We know that. But Zelensky has been a modern leader. He hasn't, before this conflict erupted, he had his problems with popularity because the economy was stalled and there were issues there. But it's still different. It is a more, this is the great debate within Ukraine, is whether they are part of the West and want to be part of Europe, or whether they want to be part of Russia. And the West was winning, in a sense. The attitudes of Ukrainians were much more pro-Western, anti-Russian, especially since Russia took away Crimea. Ukrainians have become more Western.
Well, yeah, because they had a little taste of freedom.
They had a taste of it.
That's what it is. 100% of the time, people are going to prefer this to the situation under a despot. But unfortunately, they never know. The citizens in North Korea have no clue. They think they've got it good. Yeah, they don't. We'll take a break. When we do come back, we'll focus a little bit more on what your expertise is, of course, and it's American foreign policy and the role in what we see the U.S. doing and what more the U.S. can or will do in the coming days. And we can take some phone calls. If you're on hold, stay there. We'll get to your call. 737-7587. Your thoughts and opinions welcome as always. We'll be right back after this.